Hi, my name is Jessica Ingle, and I'm the curator for Crafting Cultural Hybridity, a selection from the Marilyn and Jerry Comer collection of photography. I am currently a PhD candidate in aesthetic studies here at UTD, specializing in Texas art, feminism, and photography, and I'm also the former RA for the Comer collection. After 3+ years as the research assistant, I know the collection very well and was super excited to curate a major project for it. And then COVID hit and the show was delayed a year. Needless to say, I'm thrilled that this exhibition has finally come to fruition. But before I begin, I want to say a quick thank you, first and foremost, to Jerry and Marilyn Comer for their continued generous support of the collection. I also want to thank Brian Scott for helping me hang the exhibition and literally making it come to be. And then finally, a thank you to Marilyn Wallagore and Diane Durant, the former and current directors of the Comer Collection, without whom this wouldn't have happened. And a thank you as well to you all for tuning in and listening to me today, or coming and visiting the exhibition and watching this video on the screen. So I'm going to talk a bit about my process and how this show came to be, and then I'll dive right in and explore the works. In my studies, I've always been drawn to portrait photography and really curious about the relationship between a photographer and their subject. This relationship is typically discussed in scholarship as binary, with a photographer positioned as either insider or outsider of the community that they portray. An insider is defined as a photographer that relates to their subject through shared cultural experiences or shared intimacy as a friend, family member, or lover. Conversely, an outsider is generally a stranger with no direct association to the subject's community. As an outsider, there can be clear bias on the part of the photographer. If any of you have seen 19th century ethnographic photos, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In these images, there is a clear goal to portray their subjects, whom are typically people that the Western world is attempting to colonize, or the photographer's country is attempting to colonize, as savages, heathens, uncivilized, etc., which is clearly problematic. But to a lesser degree, photographers taking pictures of people that they don't know can, of course, be problematic because of the preconceived notions that they bring to the camera and to the lens, and that can be portrayed in these images. That being said, as an insider, you might know these people intimately, and you want to either portray them in a manner that reflects your relationship with a person or group of people, or perhaps you do it subconsciously and still, your relationship with these people comes through. So a lot of photography scholars have debated this issue for decades and will likely continue to debate them for decades to come. There's one scholar in particular named Abigail Solomon Godot who attempts practical applications of this debate in chapter 1 of her book, Photography After Photography, Gender, Genre, History. Essentially, Godot argues that a picture can never truly show the truth of something, but it can importantly show a truth. So this is really key. And Godot recommends deadpan as a style that can show a truth to the viewer. And I'm going to talk about deadpan more in a bit, but suffice it to say, this seems to be the only form of photography that she thinks offers some kind of truth about a subject, or at least the only one she endeavors to discuss. So while I believe that deadpan definitely does that, I'm not here to refute that. And if you look to the far right wall in the exhibition, you're going to see a number of works that exhibit this deadpan style and that exhibit this truth, I believe. But I also strongly believe that other stylistic works can do this as well, and this exhibition is going to take a look at some of those styles. Before we talk about specific works, there's another important scholar I want to talk quickly about, and that's critical theorist Homi Bhabha. Bhabha, who is not a photography scholar but is a brilliant mind and one very familiar with relationships of power and subjectification, wrote an essay titled Beyond Photography that addresses this very subject. Bhabha believes that photographs can create a bridge between the subject of a photograph and the viewer through what he calls blind spots. These blind spots, and I'm going to quote him here, turn viewers from passive recipients of the truth of the image to active agents involved in various kinds of critical interventions, reading the picture against the grain, questioning the framing of the truth, interrogating the representational limits of the photographic medium, Displacing the viewer's angle of vision, the blind spot creates desires for new knowledges, experiences, and effects with which to reconstruct or deconstruct the image. For Bhabha, these blind spots lead to what he calls a photograph's dynamic of displacement, which essentially reaches out to the viewer and piques this interest. So in layman's terms, this visual element not only causes the viewer to question the photograph, but also links the viewer with the photograph's subject by creating curiosity and ultimately a sense of empathy. So when I started looking for works in the collection that I felt like spoke to this idea and could not only pique the viewer's interest, but to get some kind of truth of the photograph, I immediately thought of the work of Gay Block. Lucky for me, Gay agreed to be the Comer Collection's honored photographer, and the rest is really history. In total, there are 8 works by Gay Block in the show, and I'm so honored to be able to include her work in this exhibition. The exhibition will be up in the gallery through April 24th, so if you'd like to see it in person, reach out to the gallery and set up an appointment. You'll also be able to experience it virtually if you'd prefer that. And I'm going to be talking about the works in order from left to right, as if you are walking through the exhibition space. So if you are watching this in the gallery or viewing it virtually, you can follow right along with me. So let's get started. So the first method that I'm going to look at for achieving cultural hybridity, or creating this bridge between the viewer and the subject and ultimately portraying a truth, is the use of archival practices. So this style documents subjects oftentimes through a combination of text and image, and all of the works in this exhibition use that text and image. And it's really meant to portray an almost scientific aesthetic, I would say. This style typically connotes in our minds a thorough investigation of a subject, and it makes us feel as if we've been presented with all the facts. And compared to other stylistic choices, this archival style is relatively objective. So this approach can be seen in the work of Gay Block, whose Rescuers, Portraits of Moral Courage in the Holocaust series documents individuals that helped Jews escape and evade the Nazis during World War II. Block created this project in collaboration with writer Malka Drucker, the culmination of which is a book containing 105 portraits and interviews, as well as a traveling exhibition that has been displayed at the Museum of Modern Art. Block photographed these individuals in their environment, either at home or surrounded by their possessions, and the subjects chose their own clothing and accessories. Block also didn't pose these individuals and instead allowed them to move freely as she photographed them. So in the case, what I just love about this image is that Antonin Kalina apparently decided that he needed to be portrayed with his pet turtle. I assume that's his pet. In the case of Zofia Benieka, Poland, which is an image that sits on the same wall as Antonin Kalina, Block was recorded as saying, or quoted as saying, "Zofia smoked like this, lighting one cigarette from another during the entire interview." So it's clear that the subjects are able to control some aspects of their image, including attire, pose, props, and surroundings. But Block does have artistic decisions, such as framing and image selection. But she utilizes a documentarian aesthetic that imparts the photographs with the appearance of detachment. Alongside Block's images, the Rescuer series contains excerpts from Drucker's interviews with the subjects, as can be seen here, as well as personal mementos and photos, thus providing context for each subject. So here, the artifacts act as evidence, anchoring the subjective first-person accounts in an impartial portrayal in a manner similar to Block's portraits. So when you combine these two things, these interviews and personal mementos together with Block's photographs, it presents an objective yet simultaneously compassionate view of the rescuers. However, Block's photographic style and the use of text and mementos do more than just that. The portraits all use a repetitive theme with a similar style, framing, and background, while the interviews and mementos share a similar format. So through this equalizing documentation, Block and Drucker are referencing the historical practice of catalogs or archives, and thereby creating, as Bhabha states, an ongoing measure of meaning and value in transition as translation that transfers modes of signification across cultural media and that represents the culminating move of the dynamic of displacement. Block's linkage between portraits and historical devices call for the viewer to dig deeper and investigate the images. We begin not only to recognize the commonalities throughout the series, but also discrepancies. We attempt to discern the photographer's hand in the photographs as a marker of their subjectivity and search for signs of the individual portrayed, the turtle or the chain smoking. We feel sympathetic towards the subjects and become interested in learning more about them. It's through this questioning and commitment that we traverse the separation between communities and attain cultural hybridity. So another example that I want to talk about really quickly from this section is the work of Diane Durant. And the 3 photographs in this exhibition come from her Stories series. And this series contains pictures of her daughter Andy throughout various years. This project lasted a number of years, so Andy is varying ages. And Andy is posed oftentimes in front of locations, wearing different outfits, poses, makeup, carrying different props, and all of the images are accompanied by phrases, handwritten phrases underneath. And these images are meant to evoke memories or moments in Diane Durant's life. So she uses Andy as a proxy for her own childhood. And these images, as opposed to Gay Block's works, are much more diaristic, if you will. They're much more personal. They feel as if, they've been taken from a diary. And this is really significant, right? Because you feel as if you're connecting directly with Durant. So she still uses an element of archival. You feel like these are snapshots. You feel like these are from her diary. But she also still uses this archival style with combining text and images. So along the back wall of the exhibition are a series of images that use various signs and symbols to elicit common ground between the viewer and the subject. These symbols first pique our interest and then create a level of recognition in the viewer that can kind of get us over the hump, as it were, to familiarize us or sympathize us with the subject. There are 3 main types of symbols or signs in this exhibition, and the first makes reference to marketing or ad campaigns. So the one I'm going to talk about that makes reference to ad campaigns is Hank Willis Thomas, whose branded chest depicts the torso of an African-American male with a Nike logo on the left pectoral muscle as if branded onto the skin. This image is one in a series titled Branded, where Thomas has digitally added Nike logos to various areas of black male bodies where a jersey or helmet logo might be seen in a professional sporting arena. With this gesture, Thomas is clearly alluding to his subjects as professional athletes, yet their actual status is unknown. Thomas provides no indication as to who is depicted, and each photograph is centered around unidentifiable body parts such as a torso or the back of a head. By obscuring the identity of the subject, Thomas is creating an archetype of professional athletes, ultimately allowing the viewer to more readily connect and empathize with the subject. This archetype not only creates a framework for cultural hybridity, but negates the significance of Thomas's gaze altogether, and his position as either insider or outsider in relation to the community is moot. So just to give you a frame of reference, this image is one that I found online from a Nike ad campaign. And as you can see, the logo is always on the left side of the chest. And in this image, the model or individual you can't figure out who he is, right? Even though it shows a little bit more of his features, I wouldn't be able to pick him out on the street if we were both walking past each other. And that's really important. That's something that Thomas is getting to. So the aesthetics of these images, in particular that of branded chest, call upon the tradition of nudes seen throughout the history of art, which has resurfaced and been further sexualized in contemporary advertising campaigns. The word brand plays a dual role in Thomas's series, referencing both advertising brands, of course, and the historic practice of branding African-American bodies during slavery. A clear connection can be made between ideas of ownership of Black bodies and the corporations that advertise on and through these bodies. In this series, Thomas is not only drawing on historical knowledge of slavery in the United States, but is mixing the vernacular of classical art nudes with that of advertising. Through Thomas's appropriation of various signifiers and codes, the viewer is invited to challenge not only the photograph itself, but the validity of these linguistics, and we question whether or not the brand is real, which leads to an interrogation of the problematic relationship between companies and the bodies that they use to sell their products. So when I look at this image, I can see the brand as real. It feels real to me. And then you immediately think, wow, Nike's branding people? And ultimately, we empathize with the subjects through this space of cultural hybridity that Thomas is creating. And so we're invited to investigate the relationship between Black bodies and capitalism. So the next group in the signs and symbols category that I'm going to talk about makes reference to various art historical works. And not all of these, I want to make note, are going to be commonly known references. So you may not look at the image and say, oh, I know what painting that references. You may not know the exact work, but they're recognizable regardless for a type, right? It's still going to elicit the same relative response. So the one work I'm going to talk about in this section is this work by Gordon Parks, Ella Watson, American Gothic, Washington, D.C. And to give you a little background on this image, Parks was hired by the Farm Security Administration, the FSA in Washington, D.C., to photograph the African American community there, and just generally the community of D.C. And he didn't have any idea when he arrived in January 1942. Coming from Chicago, he didn't realize the challenges that he would face as a Black man. And the FSA director, Roy Stryker, kind of realized this could be problematic for you. So he immediately recommends to Parks that he just explore the city without his camera so he can get an understanding of it and a feel for it, and see if he can gain access in ways that a photographer perhaps wouldn't. Well, during this time, Parks finds racism everywhere, and it's rampant. He is kicked out of theaters, turned away from restaurants, denied service, all kinds of things. So he returns to FSA headquarters demoralized, and Stryker reaches out and says, hey, why don't you just start smaller? Just look into the FSA offices and start from there. And so he starts wandering through the FSA offices and bumps into Ella Watson, who is a member of the cleaning crew of the FSA offices. And she begins to tell him her life story, that she became pregnant right out of high school, that her husband had been shot to death 2 days before their second daughter was born, and now she worked to support herself and her 2 grandchildren. And by the end of this conversation, Parks asks if he can photograph her, and she agrees. I'm not sure if this photograph, which photograph this bookends in this collection of images, if it was the beginning of their relationship or at the end, but she gives him access to her community for 4 months. And the resulting photographs are really stunning and phenomenal. He depicts really the lows and the highs of Black communities at this time, you know, the rampant poverty with crumbling homes and trash-filled neighborhoods, but also the beauty of the community, the people, and the shared love that they have or had. He photographs families sitting around tables, and he goes to church with Watson and photographs them at church. So it really is a wonderful picture of the African American community in DC at this time. And this piece, whether, you know, which end it falls on in the collection, he photographed Watson standing in front of the American flag at the FSA offices with a broom in her hand and a mop propped up behind her. And this is in direct reference to this painting by Grant Wood titled American Gothic. And I'm sure that many, if not all of you, are familiar with this work, which has been really held up for generations as a symbol of the American pioneer spirit. You know, 2 hardworking American farmers that are stoic. And of course, what happened shortly after this was painted is the Depression. And as it was exhibited more and more, it became known for and really exemplified this American spirit in the face of the Depression, in the face of hardship. They continued to work and struggle to keep their farm and stay alive. So, by referencing this, Parker is making clear ties to America and patriotism, especially with the large flag hanging behind her. So it's, showing her as working hard and charting a path. And as Americans, we can all see this, right? We can connect with this as part of the American dream. But he's doing this with a Black woman who has likely had limited opportunities in her life and faced rampant racism in her city. And this has not been done with Black figures at this time to show them as part of this American narrative. So the final section I'm going to talk about is religious symbolism. This final group is going to be similar to the art historical references in that we may not recognize exactly which symbol is being represented, but we will internalize it in some way. So I'm going to quickly talk about this work by Robert Capa, who was a well-known war correspondent during World War II, and some of his most famous images were taken on the beaches of Normandy during the D-Day invasion. So he was literally storming the beaches of Normandy with U.S. soldiers as they were traversing barbed wire and being shot at, and grenades were thrown at them. So he was clearly not, although he may have been terrified, he was willing to do what was necessary, go into the trenches and do what was necessary to get the images. Aside from his D-Day shots, he jumped from a plane with U.S. paratroopers and also witnessed the liberation of Paris from a Jeep. What is important to note about these war correspondents at this time, Capa included, is that they were portraying a certain vision, right, of the war. They wanted to portray soldiers as heroes, these American heroes that were selfless and liberating, the European people. And they wanted to justify the war, so they needed to show the degradation and awful settings of the war, as well as the heroism of the soldiers. So a lot of his photos went beyond the battle. He would shoot civilians, war-torn villages, and in this case, resting soldiers. Here, Capa has taken the image standing slightly above the soldier, where he's reclined backwards. And compared to his other photographs, this image is relatively tame. Other than the exhausted soldier, for instance, there's nothing really interesting happening here. This soldier pose, however, is extremely reminiscent of a very famous religious subject called the Pieta. So if you do a Google search of this subject, you're sure to come up with about 1,000 images. To include, there is a very famous Michelangelo sculpture in the Vatican titled Pieta. But this painting is from the 1500s by Titian, and it is also in the Vatican. And the pose seems remarkably similar to that of Capa's soldier. So by making this reference, Capa is lifting this man up as a selfless, sacrificial hero, and we are immediately sympathetic to him. So you can see here, just to go back, you can see the similar poses. But importantly, and to kind of further my argument, if Capa were to have taken the image of this man here and just to show him in the photograph, would this have had the same effect? Would you be as interested or sympathetic with him? I would argue no. So the last stylistic choice I'm going to talk about is deadpan, which can be seen in the far right wall of the gallery space. And Godot states that deadpan provides a way to think about a truth of appearance that without prodding reveals itself to the camera. So it's through deadpan's seeming objectivity and remoteness that the subject reveals an aspect of itself through an unencumbered view provided by the photographer. The deadpan aesthetic is characterized by highly detailed images, often on a monumental scale, although that isn't true about these images. We don't have any in the collection that are monumental in scale. But they also lack sentimental or subjective framing by the photographer. Deadpan photography may be highly specific in its description of its subjects, but its seeming neutrality and totality of vision is of epic proportions. So in a manner similar to the archival style, deadpan provides a relatively objective view of its subject. So an excellent example of this aesthetic can be seen in Zanele Mujole's Lorado Doomsday, Syracuse, New York, whose portrait of her longtime friend Lorado Doomsday seems both intimate and distant, familiar and foreign. Her gaze appears almost aggressive, while at the same time it looks as if it could just be that Mujole has caught Doomsday glancing up at the camera. In a moment's notice, she's caught her. Although Mujole's oeuvre, which includes both self-portraits and portraits of members of the South African gay and lesbian community of which she was a member, could comfortably be associated with the subjective insider style of artists like Nan Goldin, this photograph provides a dispassionate and relatively banal view of Doomsday often seen in deadpan style. The neutral background, the detail rendered in the photograph, you can see all the blemishes on her skin, and the tight framing around her face and her ambiguous gender as well provide little insight into Mujole's view of and relationship with her subject. Yet these attributes also entice the viewer to engage with the photograph and question Mujole's image. We're intrigued by Doomsday's depiction and drawn in by the gaze that meets our own and connect with her. And as Solomon Ghost suggests, this detached style offers the viewer a glimpse at Lorado Doomsday that reveals the truth about her. So in summation, I want to just quickly say that this exhibition is not meant to be the full authority on all works that can create a cultural hybridity. I hope that it acts as a jumping off point, a starting point for further research into other stylistic approaches that can create this bridge or this sympathy between the viewer and the subject. But I want to thank you for joining me, whether it was online or in the gallery, and thank you for stopping by to see the exhibition if you are seeing it in person. I hope that you enjoyed the show, and I look forward to any questions that may arise after the end of this. Thank you so much.